Hi, this is Mr. Blake, and this is for everybody who, either for technical reasons or whatnot, missed today's presentation on the Berlin crisis, which was just a conversation that we had. There's no set of notes or anything for that. Nothing that I'm going to post for it except this. For those of you that did miss out, Monday, I was talking about the Berlin Conference and the significance of the Berlin Conference for sub-Saharan Africa and all of Africa, really, in particular. The Berlin Conference was held, in Berlin. It was a conference of European major countries to divide up Africa. And the question is, why would they decide to suddenly divide up Africa? And you have to go back a little bit in time and realize that the Europeans knew that Africa was a resource wealthy place. They knew that, and you saw that in the little documentary that I showed you, that they were aware that these were often wealthy, powerful kingdoms that you would find in Africa. But also, when you start looking at the 1800s, Europe has industrialized, and they need resources to fuel their industries, their factories, to feed those machines, to make all the stuff that they're making. And so when they start looking around going, where are we going to find these resources that we may not have in Belgium or France or Germany or whatever, they start looking at Africa. And this is the great age of European imperialism, where they're going to go in and take over territories to rule themselves, mostly for economic reasons, to control the trade or to extract resources. So beginning in the 1800s, we begin to see large-scale colonization of Africa, that you start seeing territories being taken over by the Dutch or the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the British, and so forth. And originally, it was mostly just to set up trading posts and that sort of thing. But they eventually want to have complete control over that area, to really put their flag on it, and that this is going to be British territory, this is going to be French territory, or whatever. And if they're claiming the same areas, usually for the same reason, which is access to those resources, then you could potentially have conflict between European countries. And they wanted to avoid that because a war fought in Africa between, let's say, the French or the Germans, or the French and the British, or the Portuguese and the British, or whatever, could easily spread then to Europe. And they didn't want to fight a European war. So in order to prevent that kind of violence, they set up the Berlin Conference. And again, it was held in Berlin at the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s. And what it was is the big European powers sat down at a table, literally with a blank map of Africa, and divided it up amongst themselves. That this was going to be Portuguese territory, this was going to be French territory, this was going to be British territory, and so forth. And when they were looking at that map, what they were looking at is resources. They want this particular territory for their kingdom, their republic back in Europe. And so it was resource extraction. And if they could draw the boundaries up and divide it all up amongst themselves, then they could avoid those sort of conflicts between colonial powers fighting over territory. And so they go through and they divide all of Africa up amongst themselves into a British zone, a French zone, Portuguese, or whatever. Now, these borders that they drew, one of the things you have to remember is, at the Berlin Conference, anyone sitting at that table, not a single one of them had ever been to Africa. They had no idea what was there. Most of the map was blank because the Europeans didn't know anything about the interior of Africa. They had sent explorers in, like Livingstone and stuff, but their reports were very, very sketchy and not necessarily reliable. And so what most of the Europeans knew was the coastline. They'd mapped that out, and they knew some of the cultures and resources along the coastline, but the interior was a big mystery. And so when they're drawing these boundaries, they're often drawn with no idea what actually was there. They were just dividing it up. We want this territory, you can have that territory. And so if you look at a map of Africa, you'll often find that the lines are straight. Somebody just used a ruler and drew a line and said, okay, that side's going to be yours, this side's going to be mine. The squiggly lines were often driven or drawn along rivers that they knew at least something about that river. But rivers are really poor boundaries because, especially in dry areas like West Africa, that tends to draw all your population into that one area. And so you're actually drawing a line that's separating people where probably is the highest densities of people you got. So they drew those lines, and then some of the squigglies are just squigglies because they thought, well, there's probably more there, so we're going to just make it squiggly. And they extended a squiggly line. If you don't get the thing that I'm telling you here is the boundaries in Africa are idiotic. They're stupid. They make no sense whatsoever because the one group of people who were not represented at the Berlin Conference were Africans. They did not take into any sort of account who was living there, except for they saw them as a workforce. These people can mine our mines. These people can plant and sow our fields as we harvest commercial crops. In West Africa, they're going to be the farmers, the agricultural workers. They'll be our miners and stuff. They didn't see them as people. They saw them as workers. They also saw them as Africans because they're all Africans, right? And all Africans are exactly the same. So when they drew these lines, not knowing that the territory that they just carved up might have 27 different languages spoken there. And of the 27 different languages, at least 5 of them that speak different languages all hate each other too. And so you've created territories where you have clumped people together that may or may not like each other at all. And that could create some problems. Now, how did they justify doing all this? This thing known as imperialism? Well, it's easy to do to take somebody else's territory away if you can convince yourself that you're a better person and that they are an inferior person. And so you would see things like, oh, look, here's some Africans, and they live in an area where there's rich copper deposits and gold deposits and iron deposits. And guess what? They're only mining the gold. They don't even know what to do with the copper and iron, right? Therefore, they can't be all that smart. And therefore, it's okay for us to come in and step into Africa and take over their territory because we're going to use those resources properly. We're going to use them in our factories back home. And while we're there, we'll show all these savages, these primitives that are Africans, what is proper civilization. And you might have gotten that kind of idea of how wrong that is from the little video I showed you, right? These were often very wealthy, sophisticated societies. They were perfectly civilized without the Europeans showing up. But as a European looking at that, you say, okay, I'm going to bring them European culture and civilization. We're going to show them how to speak French so that they're speaking a civilized language and not all this jibba-jabba that we don't understand. We're going to show them how to dress properly because they're not dressed properly the way that an Englishman or a Frenchman would dress. We're going to show them the proper things to eat. And of course, we're going to give them the proper religion all at the same time. We're going to bring all this civilization to them. And that's the justification. If you can think about it that way, you can then justify taking somebody else's stuff. Because they're inferior to you, and therefore they're not going to use it properly anyway. I am. And that's how the Europeans justified the entire division of Africa and taking land away from people that didn't belong to them. Now, what's the long-term consequences of all this? Under colonial administration, most European countries did not spend any amount of money developing their colonies. They wanted it there for markets to sell their stuff. They wanted to extract raw materials and food, and that was about it. They didn't bother with schools. They didn't bother with hospitals. They didn't bother with power plants or any of that sort of thing. The infrastructure was usually not put into any of these colonies. All they wanted was enough infrastructure to get stuff to the ports so they could ship it back to England or France or wherever it was going. So that means that Africa, for 100 some odd years, doesn't have that infrastructure built into these what will eventually become countries. There is no sense of self-government anymore. That's been taken away from them, and they're ruled from London or Paris or wherever the colonial power was. So they lose that sense of being in control of themselves. Without the infrastructure, they're also not going to industrialize. And in fact, the Europeans didn't want them to industrialize because that would compete with their own industries. So they actually deliberately made sure that African countries didn't develop any sort of industrial infrastructure either. That's a problem because in the 20th century, starting in the 1950s and going on into the 1970s, these African countries start getting independence from their colonial ruler. And that means that as a new country, suddenly you're free and independent, yay, but you don't have any infrastructure. Your population is often very ill educated. It doesn't have any sort of healthcare structure in its place. And often as not, they don't even control the resources that are in their country. Yes, my country is wealthy because it has a platinum mine and a gold mine and a diamond mine, and we raise coffee on plantations. But none of that we own. It's still owned by somebody back in Europe. The plantation is owned by some coffee company back in London. The mining companies are maybe French or Spanish or British or, heaven forbid, American. And so we don't control our own resources. We're not getting wealth from our own land because somebody else owns it all. Now, at this point, as an independent country, we could say, that's not fair, right? They're getting all the profits to all our resources. So let's just take it back. And so we nationalize the mines, we nationalize the coffee plantations, and now it is state owned by whatever African country we are. And now there's another problem. One, we threw out probably all the Europeans that ran all this stuff. But who's going to run our plantations? Who's going to be the mining engineers to make sure that the mine is safe and keep the machinery working and stuff? We have a country where 95% of the population is illiterate. They can't read or write. We don't have college educated people in our country. And so you run into the problem of assuming you get rid of the Europeans, you still can't run things without them. And eventually you have to ask them to come back. And when they come back, they're probably going to want a cut of everything coming out of the mine or the plantation again, right? And so again, the money's leaving the country and you are not benefiting from your own wealth. And this has been the tragedy of Africa and the tragedy of the Berlin Conference. The long-term consequences to Africa because of this division and colonization. There's obviously that their populations were set back in things like education without health care. They still have very low life expectancy rates. Their infant mortality rate is still very, very high because they don't have that medical infrastructure. It was never put into place. But it gets worse because what is going on in the rest of the world in the 1800s is the Industrial Revolution. And Africa is denied the right to industrialize the way the rest of the world gets a chance to go industrialize. Most of them don't get their independence until the 1960s. And when that happens, they've not industrialized. And so much of sub-Saharan Africa is in the process of trying to catch up virtually a century behind everybody else. That's not their fault that happened. That was outside sources doing that sort of thing. But it's a problem that they face to this day. And it gets worse because if you think about the speed at which technology changes in our world today, just think about how fast technology changes in your own life. New cell phones, new computers, refrigerators that talk to you, and all this stuff that we make as technology progresses. That's what's happening here, and the technology is moving really fast, right? It's changing fast. Well, it's changing in Africa too, but about this speed. And so as time goes on, they tend to become more and more behind in the technological changes. And in fact, Africa's further behind now than when it was when these countries got their independence because of that change in technology. We are getting new cell phones. In their countries, they're trying to turn the lights on 24 hours a day, making that possible. That's where they're at. And as try as they might, they're having a very, very difficult time catching up that gap that was imposed on them through colonialism. So that is something to think about. Other long-term consequences of the Berlin Conference is as you divide up this area and as they fall under control of various European countries, you have to ask the question, what do the Europeans bring with them? And in this case, start thinking about your invisible suitcase. What's in that bag that you carry that's invisible? So if you go to Western Africa now, and if you're standing in the marketplaces of Western Africa, the chances are, if you're listening to people, they're speaking in French. Now, at home, they may be speaking something completely different, Hausa, let's say. But because this was part of the French Empire and the French colonial empire in Africa, it may well be that the country that you live in has 20 different languages completely different from each other. And yet the one language that everybody understands is French because maybe you got taught that in school. All the documents of government are in French. It becomes the lingua franca of the marketplace. You speak French because that's the one language that everybody understands. You go home and speak something else. If you were part of the British Empire, the chances are, if you go into the same sort of marketplace, you're going to hear people talking in English. They may go home and speak Kwa, or maybe 42 other different languages in your country, but in the marketplace, we speak English. The documents of government are in English. And so that's a long-term consequence. Think about religion. In sub-Saharan Africa, most people will follow some flavor of Christianity. That was brought in by the colonials and missionaries that brought this religion into this part of the world. That's a long-term consequence. The way people choose to dress. If you look at Africa today, sub-Saharan Africa, most people will tend to wear kind of Western dress. You'll see a lot of T-shirts. You'll see a lot of shorts. You'll see flip-flops and stuff like that. That's part of the Western culture. And so we have, as a result of this contact with European culture, that they have adopted a lot of Western traditional dress and things like that too, as part of their daily life, which is very different than what would have been seen prior to the arrival of the Europeans. So anyway, this is my little short discussion of the Berlin Conference. Remember the key details of the Berlin Conference. Why did they have it? To avoid violence between European countries as they divided up Africa. Long-term consequences about the borders. The borders are insane. And unfortunately, most of these countries kept the same borders on independence. And so we're still stuck with them today, even though they make no sense whatsoever. They're arbitrary lines on a map, but they divide people. We may have one group that half of them is in one country and half of them is in the other. Do you think that they might want to come together and be their own country? And if so, could that lead to conflict? Or conversely, you have a country that has 27 different ethnic groups that make up that country. Oh, and 5, 6, or 7 of them all hate each other. And so you're in the same country with a whole bunch of people that hate each other. That's probably cause for conflict as well. So the lines don't make any sense, the borders don't make any sense, and they tend to produce conflicts between people. Other long-term, the presence of Christianity as a religion, the languages that maybe people speak are still part of their colonial history. The architecture, the buildings may be French or British or Spanish in origin. So maybe you'll see some flavor of Europe still in sub-Saharan Africa. So again, think about long-term consequences of colonial occupation. And again, for those of you that we had technical issues, sorry about that. I hope this helps. I'll see you tomorrow.